Welcome, everyone, to this extraordinarily exciting episode of Beyond the Crucible. This is not for this 1 week only. This is not so much a podcast episode as it is a celebration episode, because I'm going to dispense with my normal preamble about what the show's all about, and I'm simply going to read from the cover of this book, Crucible Leadership, what the subtitle of the book is, because the subtitle of the book is what this podcast is all about. The subtitle of this book is Embrace Your Trials to Lead a Life of Significance. The author of this book, the reason why today is a celebration, is because today is the publication date of this book, and the author of this book is the host of Beyond the Crucible, Warwick Fairfax. Warwick, let me be the first one to congratulate you, at least on the day that this is going to air. Your book is live, so congratulations. You are officially an author.
Well, thank you so much, Gary, and thank you being with me in the journey. It's kind of hard to believe. It's a lot of years coming that we'll discuss, but that's hard to believe that as of the date that this podcast airs, that the book will be available and it will be published. An amazing thing.
Yeah. It is available right now. Crucible Leadership, Embrace Your Trials to Lead a Life of Significance. I promise you, listener, this will not be an entire podcast full of sales pitches, but if you'd like to hit pause and go get the book right now, you can go to crucibleleadership.com and buy it right there at the page. But so let's sort of talk big picture about what we're going to talk about here. Last week's episode was all about what's in the book, what makes up the content of Crucible Leadership. This week, we're going to traverse some territory we've never traversed before, or a lot of which we haven't traversed before. We're calling this, for lack of a better term, the book journey. How did we get here? How did we get from Warwick's Crucible? Specifically, how did Warwick get from Warwick's Crucible, the loss of the takeover of the family media business at a price tag of $2.25 billion in 1990? How did we get from that point? How did Warwick get from that point to the point that this book, Crucible Leadership, holding it up again for the YouTube audience, Crucible Leadership, how did that journey, what made up that journey? That's what we have not really talked about. So we've talked about what's in the book. Now we're going to talk about how we got to a book. It's sort of like this. I like metaphors. So last week, the metaphor would be, last week we toured the house. This week, we're going to study the architecture. We're going to study the plans of how the house was built. Is that a fair assessment of where we're going?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the book is one thing which, hopefully readers will find valuable, but just the whole journey, and it took years to get it to publication. That's a whole nother crucible journey in of itself. So yeah, that's a fair summary.
So before we get going, just you saying that reminds me of something that's true about Crucible Leadership. It's true about Beyond the Crucible, and it's certainly true about you, Warwick. And that is, we're doing this not as an aggrandizement of you, Warwick. This is not all about, look what Warwick went through. The idea behind what we're doing is, the reason we're going through the book journey process is because there are waypoints along this process that will help you, listener, maybe write a book, but if that's not in the cards right now, sort of sort out, make sense of your life post big crucible, post, what do you do next? This is a to quote someone who endorsed the book as equal parts memoir and masterclass. This will be a little of memoir of what Warwick went through in writing the book, but also a masterclass in some techniques, some things you can do as a listener to the podcast who's gone through a crucible to find your way back. So I think that's a fair point to make, right?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things we talk about in Crucible Leadership in the book is, vision is good, reality is better. So for the listener, you might have had a terrible crucible, and maybe you have the inkling of a vision, but how do you bring that vision to reality? I mean, how does it how do you go 1,000 miles, which it seems like what it's going to take to make it happen? And it can seem so daunting that you almost don't want to try, that it's like, it just sounds all too hard. Let's just go back under the covers and, let's just not step outside the home. But so, I think part of the objective with this particular episode is how did I go from, as we'll talk about, never wanting to write a book to getting a book published. And it was not easy, but hopefully this will help listeners with their own vision and their own dreams and their own path.
Right. And Warwick just did, I love when we do these episodes, Warwick always steals my job, right? He's the host of the show, but he steals the co-host, my setup job. Warwick just told you the bookends of this episode. Bookend number 1, I don't want to write a book. That's where we're going to start. It ends, obviously, because I've held up a book 3 times now. It ends at the book is written, and as of today, the book is published. The middle part is the writing of the book. So we're going to go through 3 pieces, 3 bits, 3 areas from how Warwick got from step 1, I don't want to write a book, after his Crucible. Step 2, I'm calling it, I may not want to write a book, but I'm being called to write a book. Stay tuned, you'll hear why. And then part 3, how do I get people to read it now that it's written? That's kind of the dance that we're going to go through here. So Warwick, when you say you didn't want to write a book, that to me is, when I first heard you say that, was a bit shocking, because there is no shortage of books on the takeover of your family's media company that was your Crucible when it fell through. There's a book, not to bring up old wounds, but there's a book called The Fall of the House of Fairfax. There's a book called Fairfax, The Rise and Fall. There's a book called Stop the Press, How Greed, Incompetence, and the Internet Wrecked Fairfax. There are other books out there. And I think where I want to start here is your voice is in none of those books. Was there never a time where you felt like, because the impulse for a lot of people, it's not just a desire, it's like a gut reaction and impulse. I want my side of the story out there. That's not your story. That's not what you wanted. You really didn't think, I need to get my side of the story out there after the takeover failed, did you?
No, it might be puzzling for some, but just to go back a bit, I mean, what I went through was so painful, as most listeners hopefully know, losing a 150-year-old family media business. I'm a person of faith, started by a strong person of faith. Losing a $2.25 billion takeover, having a company with TV, radio, newspapers, 4,000 plus employees, 700 million in revenue, fall out of family hands, go into bankruptcy, cause ill feelings, understandably, with some other members of my family, moved to America, where I've been for more than 30 years because my wife's American. The whole thing was just so painful. I just wanted to forget. I just didn't want to think about what had happened. I don't know if it was move on. I was just somehow just forget. Even going to Australia back in the 90s was painful, because I would be thrust in front of memories and the house I grew up in, a large house in Sydney on the water, and just family members, and mostly were gracious, but it was just so painful. And the other beat of the story is, it's hard to understand maybe, but I'm not wired, maybe it's wiring or values, to defend myself. I've never been one to say, oh, I was right, and because I brought a lot of it on myself. I didn't have a desire to explain this, let posterity decide for itself what my part in it. And maybe it's my faith, ultimately from my faith perspective, God judges all of us, and we're accountable there. But just this whole kind of, I was right or they were wrong, or just trying to defend yourself. I've just never been one to try to defend myself. It's just not in my DNA. I just think it's, if you're a big man, a big woman, so to speak, you don't go when they're all defensive and just defend yourself. I don't know. I just, for whatever reason, and also didn't like the limelight. I just never had a feeling that I wanted to defend myself or put my side of the story out there. I'm not like that, and B, I just wanted to forget. I wanted to move on. I did not want to relive it. So yeah.
It's interesting because you say a lot on the show. Um, when you have a crucible, you have to deal with it. You don't stick your head in the sand. Don't not get out of bed. And I want to make it clear to listeners that that's not what you're talking about. You're not saying that's what you did. You're saying that the action that you took was, at least on the subject of a book, inaction, which is a pretty powerful action given what was being tossed at you. So I just want to make it clear so people don't hear you say, I didn't want to deal with it. That doesn't mean you didn't want to deal with your crucible. You did. You grew your family, you raised your family, you and your wife Gail did all of those things, but you specifically in a box sort of set aside this idea that I need to have my side of the story told because it's just not that important to me.
Yeah, I mean, so in the 90s, yeah, I mean, I applied to a bunch of jobs, but, it's hard for a kind of ex-media mogul to get a job. Nobody believed I'd be humble enough to get just some regular job. And yeah, I mean, I tried to move on as best I could. It was difficult, I've got to say. Eventually, in kind of the mid-90s, I worked in a local aviation services company, business financial analysis. So I was trying to move on in that sense, but the idea of reliving memories and writing my side of the story and let me explain myself. I just feel that's lame and almost, it's going to sound arrogant, almost beneath myself. It's like, a lot of what I did, I brought on myself. It's not quite as simple as it's all my fault. There was rifts in the family going back decades, almost generations. But I don't want to write some tell-all book and just start, causing more harm, more friction in the family by just explaining my side and, hey, look what other family members did throwing my dad out as chairman in 1976 and whatever it is. I wanted to move on with my life, and I did not want to write a tell-all book explaining my side. And it was so painful that I didn't want to relive it. So for multiple reasons, if anybody asked, hey, you're thinking of writing a book? It's like, no, it was painful. I have no desire to write some tell-all, oh, woe is me. Those books are boring and lame, and I just wanted to move on with my life. I didn't want to go back and relive past agony for some reason. It just seemed to be no point. What's the value in that, of whining and complaining and whinging, as we say in Australia, which is whining squared. No whinging. So I wanted to move on. Basically accept my lumps and let posterity or God or whoever make the judgment, and I just have to accept that for better or worse. That was kind of my attitude, so to speak.
And it's important to say, and I'll do this as your public relations guy, when you say it was beneath you to respond in a book, what you mean isn't what most people would think is it's beneath me. Sure. I don't think you mean that. What you mean is it's antithetical to what your character is. It's antithetical to who you are. It's not how you're wired is to defend yourself. That's fair?
Exactly. It's against my values, which is, just to me, defending myself and saying, oh, look what I did. I mean, most of it was my fault, so it's not the easiest thing to defend. But, it's not just a case of, oh, that's what God would want us to do, never defend ourselves. It depends on the situation, but, my wiring is not to defend myself, is I'll do my best and let people make their own judgments. It's just, I'm not even saying it's the morally correct thing necessarily. It's just how I'm wired for whatever reason.
Right. And this is the first time that I have no idea how you're going to answer this question. So this is the fun part. I said at the top that there's some things that we're going to talk about that we haven't traversed before. And this is one of those areas. You talk so often, Warwick, about feeling when the takeover failed, after it had succeeded, when it ultimately failed. You felt like you'd let your ancestors down, your family down. I wonder, was there a part of not wanting to write a book, in addition to what you've just talked about not wanting to defend yourself, not wanting to go crawl inside that pain again for no good purpose. Was there a part of it, even a slice of it, that was you didn't want to put your family through that again either? You wanted to keep your family. You just wanted to move on the entire sort of Fairfax family from your perspective. You didn't want to get that back out in the news again if you could avoid doing that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I didn't want to put my family through it all in some big public, spat and what have you. And yeah, as you mentioned, I felt like I let my family down, parents, relatives, caused friction within the family. I felt like I let God down in some naive view founded by a person of faith, the company, John Fairfax. I thought maybe God had a plan to resurrect the company image of the founder. I'm a person of faith. So that sense of letting God down was crushing. And, I was raised Anglican, but, maybe from a Catholic theological point of view where you talk about purgatory, maybe I subconsciously felt I deserved to be in purgatory. I deserved to be blamed and for all of this. And so why defend myself? Whatever was thrown my way, maybe I felt like I deserved it. And so I deserved to be there while, incoming arrows came my way. Maybe there was some fatalistic, I deserve this pain, so don't defend yourself. Maybe I haven't thought about it quite that way, but maybe there was this weird purgatory view of life in those days. I deserve whatever I was going to get, kind of mentality.
Fascinating. Yeah, and again, to me, that's extraordinarily fascinating because we've been working together for more than 2 years, and I've never heard you sort of talk about it in that way. So I hope, listener, what you're hearing from this is some aspects of this story that just haven't really been unearthed before, haven't been talked about before, because Warwick has not until this book. I'll say it again, Crucible Leadership, Embrace Your Trials to Lead a Life of Significance, out today. If you're listening to this podcast on the day it is released on October 19th, you really haven't spoken about a lot of the things that are in this book until this book. So that is that what you just said makes perfect sense. All right. It seems like we may have gotten past the first negative section, right? The I don't want to write this book. Is there anything else in the I don't want to write this book section that you feel you need to say before we move on to how we started down the on-ramp to the road that led to the publication of the book?
Not really. It was all so painful. I deserved it, and I wanted to try and forget anything to do with Fairfax Media and my past life and move on. I guess in a couple bullets or so, that's what I was feeling.
Oh, and we could have saved like 15 minutes of the show by just doing that. But I think it was far more interesting to get the more robust discussion of what was going on. So we'll move on to section 2 of this, the turning point, the pivot point, the inflection point. And this is where where your mind changes a little bit. I've headlined this in my notes because I kind of know what you're going to say, but it's section 2 is, I may not want to write a book, but I think I'm being called to write a book. Tell us how, what are the first breadcrumbs of that? How does that come up? When does it happen in the process in terms of after the takeover, and what brings it to life?
Yeah, I mean, probably the key event was when I gave a talk in church in 2008, which I'll mention here in just a second. But there was a few breadcrumbs before then in which I mentioned I got a job in an aviation services company doing analytical kind of things. I then, from there, around about 2003, felt like I wasn't using all the gifts I had, and it was playing small. Not that it was beneath me, but I felt like I had some gifts I wasn't using. So assessment I did with a mid-career coach seemed to line up with executive coaching. I got certified as an International Coach Federation executive coach. I began to see I had a leadership perspective in the questions I was asking. So my self-esteem began growing a little bit. And then right around 2007, about a year before that talk in church, I became an elder at my church. It's a non-denominational evangelical church in Annapolis, Bay Area Community Church. around about these days, about 2000 odd. And then I got on the board of my kid's school, an Annapolis area Christian school, a Christian school. So all of those, I began to see that I had a leadership voice and I could actually contribute to things in life and society in a meaningful way. So my self-esteem, drop by drop, brick by brick, began to come back. And really a turning point, a pivot point, if you will. One of the biggest ones occurred, as I mentioned, in 2008 when the pastor of our church, Greg St. Cyr, he was giving a message on the life of David, who was being persecuted by Saul because he was a good man and Saul felt jealous. So he was hiding in a cave, feeling sorry for himself. And so the pastor asked me to give a message on a righteous man falsely persecuted. I said, well, it's not me. I brought a lot of trouble on myself. And so I gave like a 10-minute talk, and weeks and months afterwards, people said, what you said really helped me. And I'm thinking, as I often say, there weren't any ex-media moguls in the congregation that I know of. It's one thing if you're talking about cancer, abuse, loss of a loved one. Sadly, way too many people go through that. But how can you identify with, losing a $2 billion company? I mean, it's just not a normal experience. But it was
In fact, a funny story about that. You just spoke at your church a couple of weeks ago, and you talked about that thing again. You spoke again in your church, and you talked about the book. And after there's 2 services, and after the first service, someone came up to your pastor and said what to him?
Well, he said that he'd lost $200 million. And
your response was beautiful, was what?
Yeah, I said, well, that's a start, And I don't know whether that was that charitable, but in the moment, it seemed to be funny to me. So I don't know. But yeah, I'm sure it wasn't a media company. Again, it's not a competition of who can lose the most money, but yeah.
But it certainly shows your sense of humor about it and how healed you are. And getting back to your story now, you're asked to give a sermon illustration back in the early 2000s. You do so, it resonates with people. Then what happens? Because there's some really interesting stuff that happens after that.
Yeah, and it's sort of interesting as, I hadn't looked at it in a while, but as I reread kind of the speech I gave, what's eerie is that there's so much in there that I talk about today, yesterday, the last few weeks, last few months. It's what the book is all about. I hadn't decided to write a book at this point, but the whole, the whole thing about the book, the world looks at, and I'm reading from the speech I gave in 2008, the world looks at all this as a terrible loss. To me personally, it represented freedom from bondage, the freedom of expectations. I can now be free to be myself, to be exactly who God wants me to be. And I said, God has provided for me financially, not to the degree I had before, but more than enough for me and my family. I'm truly blessed. God is faithful. So it's like I'm talking about this stuff. I talk about this today. But kind of the next kind of beat in the story is I began thinking in the back of my mind, if my story can somehow help people, I wonder what that would be. Is it a book? I mean, I began my thinking from there's no way at all ever in this millennium or beyond will I ever write a book, period, with a couple of million exclamation points. There's no way. It started shifting slowly, a bit like moving a aircraft carrier. And I began thinking, So then, and this was around about April 2008. Within a few weeks, again, person of faith, elder of my church, etc. I thought, what, I'm going to, obviously I've read through much of the Bible, but they had these 90-day Bibles and, ways of doing it. So I decided I was going to read through the whole Bible in 90 days. I figured out a plan with some advice. Each day I would read a chapter in part of the Old Testament, part of the New Testament, a couple Psalms, Proverbs. And I began on May 28th, 2008 and finished August 13. And I would write typewritten notes. I mean, it's kind of bananas, but it's over 100 pages of typewritten notes, like Microsoft Word notes. That's not mean to say everybody should do it this way. I'm not saying that's at all necessary. But I just felt there was something about that speech that's like, I just felt like I need to get in touch with, from my perspective, God and his wisdom, because I felt there was something there, given the congregation's reaction. And it was somewhere along the lines of the middle of that, as I'm getting in touch with my most innermost truth, the depths of my soul, the depths of everything I believe in, the depths of everything that I am. I felt like God telling me, you need to write a book, and it needs to be a lessons learned book. But the combination of that speech in church and doing that intense Bible reading and journaling, I just knew it was from the Lord, and I knew I needed to do it. And obviously, it was going to be painful, but the call was clear, and so the long journey began in 2008 because of that.
Let's rewind a little bit for the listener who may be going through his or her own crucible. And as we say all the time, you're probably not lost $2.25 billion, but it's a crucible, and it hurts, and it's knocked the wind out of your sails, and it's changed the trajectory of your life. In your story are the breadcrumbs for bouncing back from any crucible. You say it all the time, Warwick. And it's been interesting for me, this is our 88th episode. Early on, you weren't saying this, but as we talked to more people on the show, you began to say this, and you say it often, and that is, it starts with one small step, right? The journey back to moving, as the title of the show is, beyond your crucible, is one small step. For you, that one small step was saying yes to your pastor asking you to give a sermon illustration, right?
And that was not an easy step, because talk about my story in front of,
right.
I don't know if it was 2,000 people then, maybe it was 1,500, who knows what the numbers were, but a lot of people. It's like, I don't want to do that. But I just felt like the Lord saying, trust me, you got to do this. And I'm not somebody that's comfortable speaking in front of people. I'm reserved, shy by nature in some sense. So it's the last thing I wanted to do, but I felt like, if this can help people, if this can help one person, I need to do this. It's not about how I feel comfortable. If this can help somebody, then I got to do it. And so, but yeah, that was a step of faith, a step of obedience from my perspective. And it was not a small step to get up in church and talk about what I went through. It was no small step at all.
Yeah. And it is, I forget exactly who it was. When we did the series on resilience, I think it might have been Lucy Westlake who said this. We asked her to define resilience, and I think she said, say yes. Right?
Yes.
The idea
exactly.
of resilience is to say yes. And that's what you did. As difficult as it might be, you said yes to something that was a challenge. And that you can't say yes to something if your head's in the ground. You can't say yes to something if you're in bed sleeping through it. To your point, that to move beyond your crucible, you have to, get up, do something, keep moving forward. That yes, even that difficult, that scary yes, right? Eleanor Roosevelt said, do something every day that scares you. You had to do something that scared you. And that was the turning point that led us to where we are today.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely, if it's in service of others, then it's worth doing. And so as I look back, those are the two key moments. The talk in church and reading through the Bible in 90 days was incredible. But, as I look back, I'm a person of faith, so I believe, God orchestrates things. There are a couple other things that led me to think, I can do this and this could work. I had a friend, Margie Worrell, who's Australian, who I met at some coaching conference in Washington, D.C., somewhere around 2006. And she's somebody with a lot of courage and confidence. And she, weaved her story into a book, and originally self-published. And then she sold enough that she was able to get it published. And I thought, boy, that's pretty impressive. I mean, she has a lot of get up and go, a lot of courage. And another pivot point is I was at a leadership conference in California. I think it was in Palm Desert, I believe. I still live
near there.
You're right.
I still live near there. I might have been there at the same time.
Yeah, well, you never know. I think it was like a Marriott, one of these massive places with pools and the whole setup.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And this
Yep.
was one of the top leadership conferences you can go to. You had people like Patrick Lencioni and Jim Collins, and certainly people of that caliber. Well, a guy got up by the name of Michael Abrashoff, who was a former captain in the U.S. Navy, and he wrote a book called It's Your Ship. And he wasn't Mr. Professional Speaker, but he was weaving lessons from his time in the Navy and on that ship into like a lessons learned format. Every chapter was a different theme, and each chapter talked about an aspect of being on that ship. And I thought, boy, that is interesting. Look at that, lessons learned, weaving a story in a thematic way around different aspects of leadership. Again, at the time, I wasn't thinking, let me write a book. But those were like foundations that were set. So once I'd done the 2008 talk in church and I'd done the extensive Bible reading, I just began to think this could work. And the other thing that really hit home is, he, in a sense, was up against some of the most prolific writers in leadership, great speakers. He was just a normal guy. He wasn't like Mr. Professional Speaker. But yet people were transfixed. I mean, we're talking about vice presidents, senior business leaders in the audience, because he was sharing a story. And he was sharing themes of leadership in parables and allegory. And probably the highlight for me is when somebody asked him, so, what's something that maybe you feel like you could have done better? And I don't know that he was anticipating it. He said, when you're in the Navy, sometimes you're really competitive. It's kind of about winning. It's, he was in the Pacific Fleet, making your ship the best ship in the Pacific Fleet. And I was so focused on quote unquote winning that I could have done a better job of sharing what I'd learned on my ship with my fellow captains in the Pacific Fleet. Because we're all part of the U.S. Navy, right? We're all meant to, Navy, country first. Not that he didn't put his country first, but rather than so focused on quote unquote winning. I thought that was remarkably vulnerable and valuable piece of advice that he gave. Again, the value of vulnerability for a purpose. So there were all these seeds that were sown, even though I didn't realize it at the time, so that you add them all up to the talk in church and the extensive Bible reading, it all added up to I know what I want to write. I want to write a book about my story, but through themes of leadership. And that's when the beginnings of the outline was formed.
Yeah. And it wasn't, what I love about that story about the guy at the leadership conference who holds stories of other leaders is that is what you do in Crucible Leadership. But what's great about that is it aligns perfectly. Again, we'll talk about your personality, your character, who you are. I could right now, as a test, text 10 people who know you and ask, could you imagine Warwick ever writing a full-on memoir from page 1 to page 290? It's all about just Warwick. And every one of them would say no. In fact, at some point I may, I'm going to ask Jack, our producer, who's hiding in the background, to just send me a message on Zoom, Jack, asking me if you could ever imagine Warwick writing just a memoir. It's all about Warwick. I don't think anybody who knows you thinks that would happen. So you found a way to tell your story, but to weave it together with other things that is more than just, here's what I went through. It's, I understand what you've gone through, and you can learn from what I went through how to get beyond what you've been through. And you can also learn from other leaders throughout history. That's a perfect construction for the book.
Absolutely. I mean, so as I was writing this book, I wasn't talking about what I went through to justify myself. It was largely, I don't diss or, talk badly of other people. It's really more about talking about my own mistakes, and, I'm reasonably harsh about that. But it was all because here's what I did. Don't do what I did, but instead do some of the things that other members of my family before me and other great inspirational faith historical leaders did. It was all in service of the reader. It was in service of leaders at all levels, as we like to say, from the boardroom to, from the corporate suite to, community leaders who may just want to reclaim their neighborhood park for kids. It was all in service of others. I was writing about some of the most painful things I went through, not to justify myself, not to, oh, let me just, not even just so that people would think, oh, look how bad he is or whatever, more self-flagellation. That wasn't the motive at that point. It was all about in service of others. If it can help other leaders at all levels, that was the driving mission behind the book.
And the phrase that you were searching for a few minutes ago, a minute or so ago, is from the boardroom to the living room, which I had been trying to get us to say about Crucible Leadership since the outset. And this is the first time. So on this celebration day, when Crucible Leadership, Embrace Your Trials to Lead a Life of Significance comes out, we hear it will help you become a better leader from the boardroom to the living room.
Indeed.
There you go.
Indeed.
Thank you for saying that. I feel good. That's out now. That alleviates my crucible. But I had this great line. I want it to be used, and now it's used, so I feel better. So the process of writing. You mentioned it was painful. That's what kept you away from it for a while. I assume. I actually know, but people would assume the writing process had its own pain with it.
It did. I mean, I began in 2008. It took at least 5 years to write the first draft. In part, life does get in the way, but think about writing about some of the most painful, stupidest, or just painful experience you've ever gone through. I couldn't do much more than a couple hours a day, and I had to take a break. I mean, this is so painful, reliving my worst mistakes or just the worst experiences I had. But I kept going in service of others. And I didn't have some detailed plan. I mean, I had a chapter outline of maybe 10, 12 big themes. And I knew I wanted to do it in lessons learned. I wanted the theme of authenticity. An earlier draft, I was thinking authentic leadership, but there's somebody else has that title, which, different, more scholarly work. But as I began writing that first chapter, the themes began to coalesce, the three strands. I realized my story would be the keel of the boat, but then I wanted to talk about my father and the lessons in leadership I learned from him, about my great-great-grandfather, John Fairfax, and the lessons I learned from him. I love history, so I wanted to weave in lessons from historical leaders, as well as lessons from inspirational and biblical leaders. So that was all formed by the time I was in the middle of the first chapter. And so what I would do is, I would sort of write it a chapter at a time. So if I got to a chapter and I thought, gosh, I want to weave in a story about Washington, I would stop and say, let me find a good book on George Washington. I'll read it, make notes on it, and then figure out, how can I write about it in 2 or 3 pages? And so obviously I had to pause a bit to read the book and write the notes before I finished the chapter. And so I would just go chapter by chapter until it got done, until that first draft got done. And it did take probably around 5 years. It's just a long process, of very painful. Yes, life gets in the way, but every time I stopped and read a book, it takes a while to read a good book and write notes on it from page 1 to page 500 or whatever it is. It was a long process, but I trusted the process. I mean, it's going to sound weird. I prayed every day. It's not about me. I had this mantra, if you will, that I would pray to God, and I would say, let my words be your words. Let your words be my words. I just wanted to make sure that I was writing what I felt called to write from my inner soul. And I just started and I just kept going. And eventually that first draft got done. But that was, like the end of step 1, just finishing that first draft. It was a long, long journey, just even after that first draft. It wasn't like, hallelujah, let's go get it published. It wasn't remotely that simple.
That puts us at kind of the point that we're going to shift a little bit into the next chapter, or the next chapter of the journey in a bit. A couple things we want to do before that. One thing I want to do is, one of the things you just said, we're talking here about the journey for you in writing your book, Crucible Leadership, Embrace Your Trials to Lead a Life of Significance, which is out today. If you're listening to this episode when it drops, October 19th. But a lot of the words that you said, if you took writing book out and put in another crucible, finding a job, or learning to go on after the loss of a loved one, or a divorce, or something painful, or a business failure of your own that's less than 2.25 billion, whatever your crucible may be. If you that idea of, you said it was a long process, but you trusted the process. That really is a bumper sticker for how you move beyond your crucible, right? Follow a process and trust it.
Yeah, I mean, trust, whether you believe it's, God, or, your true inner self, your inner soul. I think most people are spiritual. When it's, to your very core, the depths of what you believe is true, what you believe is right. Trust that, and trust yourself, and trust the process. I mean, I just went step by step, page by page, book by book that I was researching. Trust that it will work out, and just keep moving forward, one more step, and eventually 5 years later the book got written. Well, it would have been easy after 6 months saying, oh my gosh, maybe I'm only on chapter 1. I can't remember, after 6 months, or can't imagine it was more than 2. It's like, my gosh, this could take decades. I mean, I could have said, forget it. But I didn't, because I felt like this is too important. This is in service of other people. I didn't use the word life of significance, but if I had, it's like, this is about helping other people live their lives of significance, bouncing back from their crucibles. It wasn't fully formed, but that's what kept me going. One more step, because this is too important. We're just going to keep going, trust the process, and trust that call that I felt. And that, to your point, yes, I think everybody that's been through a crucible has that potential. And the key is that vision that anybody has. If it's in service of others, some higher calling that links to your deepest held values, that will fuel the perseverance, the resilience, as we say, to keep moving forward. But that's the key. That's inner call, that sense of in service of others. That's the key to getting something that may seem impossible done. And one final thing is, you may not feel like you've got the whole vision fully formed. Back in those days, I had no idea of podcasts and websites and social media. And, I just knew, let's just take that next step. So don't think you'll have the whole vision fully formed. Trust what it is you know now, and trust the process.
That is a good place for me to say this. If you've listened to the show in the past, listener, you know that one of the things I say in pretty much every episode is the captain's turned on the fasten seatbelt signs, and we're getting to the point where we got to land the plane soon. That's my way of saying it's getting close to time to wrap up. I'm not saying that now. I'm bringing in the plane metaphor to say this. This would be a good time for some in-flight entertainment, as it were, because you've done an audiobook, Warwick, in addition to the actual written book, Crucible Leadership. You've done an audiobook of you reading it yourself. And we have an excerpt that we want to play here because it continues the thought of the section we were just talking about. You feeling called by God to write your book, staying on that path, continuing to do it. It was hard, but you pushed through. And this excerpt gives a nice flavor for the audiobook version of Beyond the Crucible. So for those of you listening, just listening, not watching on YouTube, I'm going to say, let's roll tape, as they say, or as they used to say when they actually used tape and everything wasn't digital. For those of you watching on YouTube, we can't play the audiobook because you got video. So Warwick's going to read the section for you right now that we're playing through the audiobook.
So this is from chapter 17, Moving Beyond Your Crucible. And the subhead is Voyage of Self-Discovery, page 240. And again, this is the book here. I'm holding it up. So
way to go! That was actually selling.
I know. Who knew?
Bravo.
So I'll read it from the bottom of this page. It has taken years to get to the point where I am now. It has been a voyage of discovery to find out who I am and to live in light of it. It has taken years to throw off the weight of others' expectations and to only live in light of who God made me to be, to cast a vision all my own and make that vision a reality. Growing up, one of my dearest wishes was that I would never become world-weary. Somehow, through all the trials leading up to the takeover of the family media company and all the trials since then, I have not become cynical or lost hope. I have been a bit battered and bruised, but I have persevered. How has this been possible with all that happened? It has only been through God's strength. There are some great scriptures on perseverance that have encouraged me along the way. These are two of my favorites. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. James 1, 2-4. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. James 1, 12. These scriptures talk of how trials test our faith and give us the opportunity to persevere, which helps us become more mature. There is a refining fire, the crucible, the trials offer. I may not consider it pure joy when I consider all the trials I've been through, but I absolutely believe that God has a plan for my life, and I try to allow the trials I've been through make me a better person and try in my own way to help others. This thought that God did not mean me to be in charge of the family media company, but has another purpose for my life, has been a source of immense comfort. The belief that God does not make mistakes has been a huge and helpful thought for me. Without my faith and the thought that God is in control, there is no way I would have persevered through the trials I have been through. So long as I put my faith in God and realize that my significance is not in what I can do for God, but in what He did for me by sending His Son to die on the cross for my sins, I can put the things of the past behind me, persevere, and move on to live the rest of my story as God intended.
So what is it like, Warwick, to read your own book as an audiobook? I mean, what kind of experience was that?
Well, it wasn't easy. I was with the good folks, with Jack and Whitney and team at Content Capital in Austin, Texas, and they have a tremendous team, do a great job. But yeah, it took most of a week, 4 or 5 days to do. But it was kind of strange to just read this book out loud, and yeah, it's a whole nother, it's a whole nother experience as you go through. It was actually kind of enjoyable in some ways. It's not easy, but again, if this can help other people, it's worth doing. Some people like audiobooks. You hear my voice and yes, reliving all these moments. It was not an easy experience, but it was definitely a worthwhile experience. There's no question.
And did you find, I've written a couple books, and I find when I read back through them after I haven't for a while, it's like, I wrote that? Wow, that's pretty good. Did you find yourself as you were reading through it going, I don't remember writing that, or that was a good point, or I forgot I said that? I mean, did you surprise yourself, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, I'm sure. I don't want to say yes. Of course, I thought it was wonderful, because that sounds pretty self-aggrandizing. But yeah, obviously I read it, and it's not like it's written so many years ago. It's not like I go, gee, that doesn't make sense. The story hasn't really changed. I read earlier some extracts from a speech I gave in 2008. I say those exact same words today. The message is consistent. My viewpoints of how you bounce back from a crucible are consistent. So, yeah, it's it's sometimes it's easy to write. It's difficult. It's not easy to write these things, but you write these things and you go back and say, you know what, I need to remember that. Because in our worst days, we sometimes forget what we wrote in our best days. So, so to speak.
That's good. That's what we call on Team Fairfax a Warwickism. That's a Warwickism right there. On Team Crucible Leadership, that's a Warwickism. We'll pull that Before we move on to section 3, which is, I've titled this, How Do I Get People to Read It Now That It's Written? Before we leave the reading of it, I need to say, I said in that segment that if I asked 10 people who knew you well, can you ever imagine Warwick would write a book that would be just about himself? Given his character, that's just not who he is. And I said I would ask our producer Jack, who's in the background as we're doing this. Jack has indeed confirmed that no, he cannot imagine you doing that. That's not in your character to do so. So, all right, let's move on to the third part. So we've gotten over, I don't want to write the book. We've gotten the book written, feeling that God had called you to do it and empowered you to do it. Now you've got a manuscript in your hand. How do you get people to read it? A book isn't a book after all until it's published. How did that publishing journey start for you?
Well, it was a long journey. So I had this notion in my mind. So we're talking around about 2013 or so, about 5 years after I started writing it, that I would pursue a publish in Australia first strategy. Because my notion was, very few people have heard of my story in the US, but in Australia, it was, one of the biggest corporate takeovers in Australian business history. Fairfax Media was this iconic brand, if you will. There could be some interest. So I went down to Australia and followed up subsequently. And I was able to chat to, literary agents, to publishers, and they were definitely intrigued because, sometimes if you're not a published author, just talking to a publisher is not easy. But given the level that this company was at and the magnitude of the story, they were kind enough to, give me a hearing. And so, some was like, this is intriguing, but we want a tell-all book, And even then, it's a lot of years after the company went under in the 1990s. Even if it had been a total tell-all, would it have got published? Who knows? But they want memoirs that are like that. Just throw the dirt around. Just tell us your perspective. There might have even said charitably your truth, right? Just go for it. And I would rather the book not be published than do that. It was like a never ever will I do that, no matter what. I would rather the book never see the light of day than to do that, just against everything I believe in. And then others would ask me, so what genre is it? If you had a bookshelf in a bookstore, which is not as many of those, but, in concept, where would it go? And I said, well, it's part memoir, it's part leadership, part self-help, part faith, maybe part inspirational. That's the wrong answer to say to a publisher. What bookshelf is that on? I could say, I don't care. It could be on 5 or 6 different ones. Totally wrong answer. They want to know a shelf. So that wasn't helpful. And I didn't want this to be pigeonholed as a faith-based book or a pure leadership book or pure memoir, because my goal was more thematic. I wanted to, yes, it's a leadership book at its heart, but I wanted to tell stories of inspirational, historical faith leaders, my own story, my dad's. John Fairfax is my great-great-grandfather. It was clear in my mind what I wanted the book to be. The vision of the book was crystal clear, and I didn't want to compromise the vision. So another lesson, when you believe in your vision, persevere. Don't compromise. Compromise can be a good word. Compromising your vision when you feel it's a calling, not a good idea. One publisher, a business publisher in Australia, offered me some very good advice. Well, a couple different publishers. One said, Warwick, I know your story isn't as well known in America, but I would pursue an American publisher first, because they're going to have a blank slate attitude. They're not going to have all these preconceptions about what your story should be, and a lot of people's minds are made up, or they just have a certain preconception of what happened and how the story should be played. So one publisher said you should pursue a U.S. publisher. Another one said, Warwick, in the business space, in the business leadership space, you need a brand. You need a following of dedicated followers that, when your book comes out, will want to read it. Well, I have a Harvard MBA. I get the concept of branding. Gosh, that made sense. And so at that point, I began, I was pretty set on Australia First publishing, but at that point, it's like, okay, I get it. I probably need to be open to other things. And so through a friend of a friend, by some miracle, I don't think it's a miracle, an accident at all, some divine help, I got connected with Cheryl Farr, who runs a branding and marketing organization called Signal in Denver. And so I gave her the manuscript, and as we went through it, she and her team very insightfully said, you know, this, and it wasn't called Crucible Leadership back then. I don't know if it was Lessons Learned in Leadership or whatever the working title was. But Cheryl and the team said, you know, the story isn't the takeover. The real story is how you bounce back and how you can help people bounce back from adversity. And, you know, we came up with this phrase, lead a life significance. I said, that's really, you know, collectively, that's what it's about. And so then, you know, that whole branding thing, we said, well, we need to write a blog, and, you know, we need to get the message out there. Cheryl had known you, Gary, and, you know, your firm Raw for a number of years. He said, well, I think it might be time to get the word out about it. And so we started just talking, and you said, you know, Warwick, I think there could be a podcast here. And so you had a buddy, Steve Ryder, and Right Turn Media, and has, you know, definitely helped us along the way with the podcast. And so you've done a lot of work in radio and that kind of thing with Focus on the Family and Hollywood, and obviously many years in journalism. So it began. The whole vision began to grow beyond just a book. It began to grow into social media and blog and podcast. And then, you know, in more recent past, well, we need to, you know, get the message out through events and speaking. And so we brought on board Carrie Childers at Carrie Childers Consulting, who's helped us with that. And then as we began to think audiobook and really, you know, progressing our podcast still further, we got in touch with folks, Casey Helmick at Content Capital, and Jack and Whitney. So the vision just progressed to where we are today. I mean, each step of the road, and all these folks that I've mentioned have been extremely helpful. But, you know, each conversation, as I look back, a publisher saying, and he was the publisher of Australian publisher, you really need to think about a US publisher. And then another Australian publisher saying, you know, you really need a brand. And somebody just happened to know Cheryl at Signal, and then she knew you. And, you know, this wasn't some grand plan I had in my mind. I just tried to take the next step and the next step and the next step. Gosh, I need a brand. I can see that. You got a leadership book, you need a brand. You need a blog. And gosh, podcasting, I love asking questions. That could work. That was sort of one of the things you mentioned to me. So each of these pieces took me to where we are today.
Right. And what ended up happening is that the book Crucible Leadership birthed the organization Crucible Leadership, or vice versa, or they were both birthed kind of at the same time. There's a symbiosis there, I think that's interesting. One of the things I love about what you were just saying about people telling you in Australia that the US was probably a better market. I think that's true because in Australia, and this book is being released in Australia today as well. In Australia, the story is I think first about you, the takeover, the aftermath, and then secondarily about bouncing back from your crucible and all those things. I think here in the US, your personal story may not be as resonant here in the US, but the lessons from your story might be more resonant here. Less sizzle, more steak, if you will. But I think that's where your vision will come true. You never wanted this to be about you. And here in the US, it's going to be, about you, but I think it's first the lessons you learn that readers can learn from the book, secondarily, the memoir portion.
Yeah, I think what you said, Gary, is profoundly true. In Australia, certainly Australian media, I mean, if you're a journalist at Sydney Morning Herald or some of the other Fairfax media papers, your life has been directly affected by what I did and subsequent decades of management, which some would say mismanagement. There's whole books about what happened after the takeover failed, And even then, people somehow find a way to blame me, even in the decade since when I wasn't even in control. But, somehow things would be magically different if Fairfax family were in control. But, yeah, I mean, it's true here in the U.S., the story is interesting, but they're not so fixated on the story. They're able to say, okay, that's interesting, but okay, what can I learn from this? How can I translate this into my own life? They're not so fixated on the story that they aren't able to see, okay, what does this mean for me? So I think you're right. It is easier for a U.S. audience to look at it and say, okay, that story's interesting, but what does this mean for me in my own life, my own vision, and how do I come back from my crucible? So they're focused more on the lessons learned aspect than, all of the drama and the saga of the takeover itself. So
Right.
That's very true.
That sound you just heard, listener, was the captain turning on the fasten seatbelt sign, indicating that we have to put the plane on the ground here in just a little bit. Before we do that, though, Warwick, first, I want to give you a chance if there's something that you want to share about this journey that you've not shared, to please do so. And then I have a question for you after that.
And, one thing I wanted to mention is I mentioned that in Australia, I was concerned that people were trying to pigeonhole this as memoir, self-help, leadership, inspiration. Again, somebody mentioned to me the great folks at Morgan James, led by David Hancock, and then the imprint Mount Tabor Media that's being published, as part of Morgan James, Chris McCluskey. And both Chris McCluskey and David Hancock, when they read the manuscript, they believed in it, and they believed in it as written. Yes, we condensed it a bit because it was a little long, and which is always a good thing. Less is more.
Right.
But they didn't say, well, we got to pigeonhole it. They said, no, we believe in what it is. Yes, it's part leadership. It's a leadership book with aspects of memoir and inspiration, self-help, historical. But they didn't say, well, less God or less leadership or less self-help or whatever. So I really am so grateful for the folks at Mount Tabor Media and Morgan James in believing in this book and getting it published today. So, huge thanks to those folks.
So we're not on the ground yet. We're close. I have one final question for you, and that's this. What does it feel like to be here today, on this day, if you're listening, listener, the day that this episode drops, October 19th, 2021, Crucible Leadership, Embrace Your Trials to Lead a Life of Significance is out today. So as people hear this, Warwick, it's the first time anyone besides you and me and the production team is going to know what's in the book in any detail. You're a published author. How does that feel? How does that feel at the end of the journey that you've just spent the better part of this last hour describing?
It's an interesting question. It feels gratifying. I'm very grateful, thankful. I'm blessed. But I'm not one to sort of sit back and kind of, do a dance in the end zone and spike the football and say, yeah, look at me, I'm so wonderful. It's not in my nature. And, one of the things I've been very focused on is just because I have a book that's been published by a great team and a great publishing outfit, and have a great team, yourself, Cheryl, so many others, Carrie. But, okay, that's good, but what's the next step in the journey? Because, it's about the message. It's about helping people. It's not spiking the football and saying, oh, look at me. I just don't think that's helpful. And just because I have a published author doesn't make me better or worse than any other human on the planet. And so I'm a great believer in don't spike the football, be thankful, be grateful. But this does not make me a better human being than anybody else. And so I'm grateful, I'm thankful, but I don't have a spike the football mentality. I'm thinking, okay, great, this is good, I'm thankful. What's the next step? How can I help more people bounce back from their worst days so that their worst day doesn't define them? How can I help people have hope and healing so they can lead lives of significance, lives on purpose dedicated to serving others? I'm focused on how can I use this book and the podcast and everything we do to help others recover from their darkest days, the journey continues. The mission continues. The vision continues. And we'll see one more step, and we'll see where it takes it. I just want to be faithful to the process, be true to what I've been called to, and, let's keep going. So that's kind of my mentality.
That sound is the plane landing on the ground. It does so, Warwick. I'm going to coin a phrase. Now that the plane's on the ground and everybody's getting things from the overhead bins, I'm going to coin a phrase. What you just said, Warwick, the phrase is, that's Warwick being Warwick, right? That's Warwick being Warwick. Your lack of ego in the worst sense, in the most damaging sense. That's who you are. You started this process. You talked about it here. If my story can help some people, I'll get up in church, even though it's difficult, and I'll speak. And moving on, now that the book's out, that's exactly where you're at. I have one more thing to say, and that's this. The captain, as everybody knows, if you've ever flown in an airplane, doesn't just turn on the fasten seatbelt sign. He or she also communicates with the crew sometimes. And the crew then passes the message along. And I do have a message for you, Warwick, direct from the cockpit. It's from your wife, Gail. She sent it to me this morning to surprise you during the recording of this episode when your book comes out. And I'm going to read it to you now. Warwick, this is your co-pilot. As someone who has been in the passenger seat with you through your years of turbulence, I am so proud of your accomplishment. I know there were days you could only write for a short time because it was so draining on you to relive all the events of the past that brought you here. You held on to your belief that God would make something of the ashes left behind. I'm so impressed to see how you have used some of the toughest moments of your life to encourage others. I am looking forward to seeing the way your story and the wisdom gained from other leaders throughout history encourages others to live a life of significance! Love you, Gail.
Wow. That is just mind-blowing. I mean, that's incredible. I mean, wow. That's just such an amazing, she gets it. She gets what it's all about. She gets why I'm doing this. I mean, that's just not quite sure what to say. That's just remarkable. She's been with me, for 32 years. I mean, she gets it. She gets why I'm doing this. So she gets it. I'm so grateful. I'm so blessed to have her as my wife. And that was another thing, it'd be a different podcast, but I definitely felt the Lord's calling, saying, this is the one I have for you in life. And that was one of those steps of obedience, which I am so, so blessed by. So yeah, following the Lord and his calling, from my perspective, can lead to tremendous blessing. So I'm so blessed.
Got nothing else. Listener, we will see you next week.